Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Gittin Daf Pei. We're starting about 2/3 of the way down on Pei Gimel Lamed Beis at the two dots. We had learned in our Mishnah that Kasvo B'Socho, that if a person had written into the star, and they then tried to erase the condition that they put into the star, that is insufficient. They'd have to start with a new get. So then Rav Safra chimes in and says something that seems fairly simplistic, and that leads to a little bit of a dialogue in the Gemara. Amar Rav Safra kasra b'socho tnan. He literally repeats the Mishnah and says the same exact thing that the Mishnah said before. So then why would he do that? So says the Gemara, Pshita, that's obvious. Kasra b'socho tnan. Your mamash quoting the Gemara. Why would you say that? So says the Gemara, maybe when he wrote it in the get, he wrote it after the ikr part of the get, and therefore we might have thought things were different. Had he written it before the Torah, had he written the condition before the essential part of the get, so then afilu al peh nami pasal. I might have thought that even with a verbal addition of the t'naim that he mentioned in our Mishnah would have been pasal. Kamash malan, that the verbal does work under those circumstances. If it's lifnei haTorah, we'll see a reflection of this in the Gemara in a halacha l'maisa frame in just a couple of minutes. Then Rava argues, but Rava Amar, no, lo shanu ela la'achar haTorah. We're only talking about a case where it was actually written achar Torah, for the condition was written afterwards. About lifnei Torah, afilu al pen namilo, that had it been that the condition was made before the Torah, so then lemaisa it would be a zero, even if it was done b'peh. So that's the machlokas between Rav Safra and Rava. Rava follows his own shita. Rava used to say to people who were the people who would write Gittin, he would always give them the following warning. What would he say to them? He would say to them, make sure to tell the husband, Shasku Shasuke Leval, make sure that the husband stays silent. Just please wait until they write the Torah of the get. So as you can see from Rava, that's how he thought things should be, is that we don't want the husband even to speak, because it's possible that if he says it at just the right/wrong time, that just by talking about a condition that can cause for an invalidation of the get. And that brings us to another brisa, 7 lines or so from the bottom of Pei Dalet Amud Beis. Let's continue. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis have taught us in a brisa. Kol hatanoyin Poslan beget divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says that tanaim cannot be in a get at all. They ruin it. The Chacham Momrim kol sheposel al peh posel b'chsav. It depends. If the type of condition that you're adding is posel b'chsav, is posel b'feh, when you say it out loud, then that would also be problematic b'chsav. V'chol she'eno posel al peh, eno posel b'chsav, and anything that isn't going to posel something verbally will be fine to add into the get directly. That's what the Gemara says over here in regards to the Chacham. And the Gemara gives an example. Chutz, if a person were to say, except for, you're fully divorced except that you can't marry Chayim, like as we were discussing the other night. Sheposel al peh, posel b'chsav, the Chachamim would say that that's posel al peh. That ruins everything, and therefore you can't add that to the get. If you say al manas, which means on condition, so that's she'eno posel al peh, eno posel b'chsav, because the Chachamim hold that the condition is a zero. So they say, therefore, because there's no psul when you say the condition out loud, if you say al manas that you can't marry Chaim instead of you simply cannot marry Chaim, so then eno posel b'chsav. Amar of Zera, in regards to this brisa that we just saw here at the bottom of the page between Rebbe and the Chachamim, we actually have a narrowing of the scope of the machlokas between the two. And the 2 lines from the bottom of the page, the Gemara says, Amar Reb Zera machlokas lifnei Torah. The machlokas, as Rashi points out, is the machlokas of almanas between Rebbe and the Rabbanon that's written before the Torah. The argument is when the condition is written beforehand. You can only marry, you can marry anyone in the world except for Chaim. So that the Gemara says the only machlokas is when it took place prior to the writing of the Torah, if the ikr portions of the get, the Rebbe Sovar Gazrin and Almanas Atu Chutz, that really objectively there shouldn't be a problem. But Rebbe extends Gzeira of Almanas Atu Chutz. We're afraid that a person might write Chutz, which is, we know, is categorically problematic. The Rabbanon on the last line, Sari Lo Gazrin and Almanas Atu Chutz. So maybe the machlokas is only Lifnei Torah, is only where the condition was brought and mentioned that she can only not marry Chaim. She can marry everyone in the world except for Chaim. So says the Gemara, that's only true lifnei Torah. That's what the machlokas is. If the condition was added after the Torah, and that brings us to the top of Pei Hey Amud Aleph, then divrei hakol kosher, everyone would agree that that is going to be kosher. Umas Nisan. What about our Mishnah, the Katani Kasvo, where that was the case we started with today, where a person had written into the get the condition. So there, Kimna Bachutz, we had made an ukimta that in our Mishnah we were talking about Bachutz Aval. What would be implied that if we're talking about a case scenario where we are La'achar HaTorah, where the condition was added after the ikr of the get, so then says the Gemara of Almanas, Lopa, so that would not ruin it. How do we understand that? There's two ways to understand our Mishnah where we see that it's low puzzle, that it's not puzzle. Says the Gemara, perhaps we can say that our Mishnah is talking about a case scenario where it's lifnei hatoref, where it was written, the condition was written prior to the essential portions of the get, but it's according to the Rabbanon. Or perhaps we're talking about where the condition was added after the ikr portion of the get was written, and that's with divrei hakol, and everyone would agree to that. The Rava Omar, we had just seen a qualification of the Brisa on the bottom of the page in the name of Reb Zera. Now we see that Rava has his own qualification of the machlokas in the Brisa. 4 lines down on Pei Hey Amid Aleph says the Gemara, Rava Omar machlokas la'achar hatorah. No. The machlokas of Rabbi and the Rabbanon is when the condition was made la'achar hatorah. The Rabbi Savar Gazrin not to lifnei hatorah. They were concerned that even though right now it's written after the Torah, we're afraid that someone's going to easily confuse the location of the writing of this condition, which right now is after the Torah, and bi'ikaron, there shouldn't be anything wrong with that. But Rebbe's concerned that someone might not be such a Talmud Chacham to know the fine distinctions of when the condition is written. And he's concerned that perhaps a get could be written where the condition is written before the Torah, and that's very problematic. And the rabbis are not concerned about that if the condition was written after the ikr portion of the get is written, he says there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's no gzeira of achar hatorah atu lifnei hatorah. Aval, what would happen with the machlokas between Rabbi and the Rabbanon if the case scenario we're dealing with is mamish lifnei, aval lifnei hatorah? If in fact the condition is that it's beforehand, so then the Gemara says divrei hakol pasal, then everyone would agree it's pasal. So says the Gemara, what about our Mishnah? Because remember, we're analyzing this brisa from the bottom of Pei Dalet and Pei. Says the Gemara, Masnisa, what about our Mishnah, the Ketani Kasvo, that if in fact our Mishnah says that there was a writing, and we said that it's possible, so says the Gemara, we said it was talking about a case where she was told that you can marry everyone except for Chaim. Aval almanas lo pasul, but had it been that it was almanas, then that would not be problematic. Achar hatorah v'rabbanon, perhaps that's talking about a case that is the rabbanon, and it's the achar hatorah. So our Mishnah can be explained one way or the other. In other words, this brisa where we see a machlokas between Rabbi and the rabbanon, and we see two versions of how to understand that machlokas Rabbi and the rabbanon. One is the lens of Rabbi Zera, and one is the lens of Rava. But neither of these make it impossible for our Mishnah to be understood. And the Gemara says 10 lines down or so on Pei Hey Amid Aleph, Tani Avua de Rabbi Avin Kame de Rabbi Zera, Kasav get al Tanai, Divrei Hakol Pasal. So Avua the Rabbi, the father of Rabbi Avin, said in front of Rabbi Zera that if a get was written with the Tanai, Divrei Hakol Pasal. And the Gemara says that's not true, because Rabbi Zera himself in the bottom of the page was just commenting on this exact machlokas. Says the Gemara, Divrei Hakol Pasal, V'ha Miflag Pligi. It's not correct. There actually is a machlokas about this. You can't just say that there's no machlokas when there is. So what did he mean over here? The Gemara says we need to change the language. That when Avuha the Rebbe Avin was talking in front of Reb Zera, in the case of a man who was kasav get al tanai, and he said divrei hakol pasal, it should have really been the divrei hakol kasher. He just had the wrong word, and there's a mistake. Everyone should agree that it's fine because the almanas is really not much going on there. Chutz is a problem. Almanas is not a problem. Says the Gemara, if that's true, when would the writing have taken place in such a case? It must be la'achar hatorah. If that's true, then velema, what we should have said is hareza pasal, not ledivrei hakol pasal. It should have said hareza pasal, the Rebbe, and it would be according to the shita of Rebbe, as we saw earlier on the page. So says the Gemara, no. Tana divrei hakol asniye. We knew that the words divrei hakol were in the Mishnah, and we had to figure out, was the divrei hakol followed by the word kasher or followed by the word pasal? That's the part that we were unsure of. And kasher b'pasal, that's easy michlafla. It's easy to make a mistake. So when you know the words of divrei hakol are there, So then the only editing to make is to change it from pasal to kasher in order to make the brisa to make sense. It's not a brisa, actually. It's the comment that was made by Avodah Rabbi Avin in front of Reb Zera. Masha ein kain harei, if the language had been harei, so that's very different. We don't think that the person who authored this brisa or the people who are memorizing this brisa made a mistake in the words of Divrei Hakol. Harei zeh b'divrei hakol mechlaf le'eh. That's not common, that when the brisa really should have said harei zeh, we wouldn't have made the error in writing that down and passing on this brisa to say the words harei zeh or to say the words of Divrei Hakol if they shouldn't be there. And therefore, it makes more sense to change the words of kasher to pasal. That brings us to a new Mishnah. This new Mishnah and the duration of today's conversation is going to be about lingering remnants of marriage and its impact on a divorce. As we know, the Torah says, "V'chasav la sefer krisus," but as we've been discussing, there are numerous case scenarios where a husband leaves over a remnant. That was exactly the case we were dealing with in the past Mishnah, but we're going to see more cases of it today and analyze it more deeply, which is what happens if a husband says, that you eat pig. Or you don't eat pig. That you don't marry Chaim. So we're going to learn a few more cases like this. So let's start. We're in a new Mishnah, Pehei Amud Aleph, a third of the way down. If a man says, you're allowed to marry anyone. You're just not allowed to marry your father or my father. That's a pasuk in Chumash. So we'll see how that works out. You can't marry my brother and you can't marry your brother. Also a pasuk in Chumash. You're not allowed to marry an Eved, which we already know from Shteit and Chumash, and you can't marry a Goy. Thank you very much. It's Captain Obvious. Everybody knows this is true. Then the Mishnah adds in one more layer. And if he adds in anyone at all, with whom Kiddushin is not even chal, like all of the people in this Mishnah, in such a case, the get is kosher. Why would the get be kosher? Because your condition is ridiculous. Your condition is mamish. It's mamish mufurash psukim that are in Chumash. So if you make a get, the husband says harei at, that you're going to be megureshes, but it's on condition that you don't marry your father. There's no chalos kiddushin by a father, so his condition is a zero. So then, therefore, we basically cut and delete the line that he says about the father, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, Lamaisa. The get is still going to be kosher, because you're saying that your condition is about a person with whom kiddushin isn't even chal. That's ridiculous, and therefore the get is chal. And as for the next part of the Mishnah, things are a little bit different. Let's say a husband instead says, "You're divorced from me. Ella, you're not allowed to marry the following people: Almona lekohen gadol, which granted is aser, but there is chalos of kiddushin. Grusha v'chalutza lekohen hedyo, same deal, where it's aser, but there is a chalos of kiddushin. Mamzer sunasin Yisrael, bas Yisrael mamzer lenasin. And all of these cases, v'chol mi sheyesh la alav kiddushin, afilu be'avera aso. If the condition that the husband puts into a get is that you're not allowed to marry people, you're allowed to marry anyone in the world except for people for whom there is a chalos kiddushin, even if it's done be'isr. So then pasal, and this is interesting. So let's just give one of the specific examples. A man says to a woman, "You are hereby divorced and can marry anyone, with the exception of to marry a mamzer." Now, Afalpi, that's a pasuk in Chumash, like in the first half of the Mishnah. But unlike the first half of the Mishnah, where all of the examples were cases where the kiddushin is not chal, here, if a woman does violate the avera of marrying a mamzer, but the mechanics of the marriage actually work, and she would therefore be married, Afalpi, that it's aser. And because that condition is one that can be acted upon, because there is a chalos kiddushin, so therefore the get is problematic and it would be pasal, because that condition is not a normal condition. Says the Gemara, in the beginning of our Mishnah, when it says, and this is 3 lines into that new Mishnah, Ulechol mi she'ein la alav kiddushin, what does that mean? Says the Gemara, klala, we added in the general rule, klala dereisha, the first time it says v'chol in the beginning of our Mishnah, that's la'asuye sha'ar chayve krisus. That comes to teach us that all cases where there is a chiyu krisus in being with that particular person, that if that becomes the condition of the husband, the get is going to be kosher. What about klala de seifa? At the end of the Mishnah, when it says v'chol mi sheyesh la alav kiddushin, that any restriction that a husband makes on his newly divorced wife, that she can marry anyone except for, let's say, a mamzer, where there is a chalos kedushin, so then the get would be puzzle, and we're including lasuye, says the Gemara, sha'ar chayve lavin, any cases that even have a lav, namely any marriage where there's a lav, then there's going to be, if that's a condition in the get, then the get is going to be puzzle. Skip the parentheses. We're halfway down on Pei Hamid Aleph. We're going to be going to the bottom of Pei Hamid Beis. And the Gemara continues as follows. We're going to ask a whole host of questions. 1, 2, 3 of them will have, 4 of them will have answers. And then at the end of this piece of Gemara, we're going to have like a dozen questions, a little bit less, maybe 5 or 6 questions, all of which will end in a teku, and all of which are dealing with the following. Where is the line of krisos if the husband leaves over a remnant of his control in the marriage? Let's get started. The Gemara says right after the parentheses, Ba'amine Rava me Rav Nachman. What if a husband says you're hereby allowed to marry anyone chutz mikdushe katan, except that you're not allowed to marry someone who's a child? Says the Gemara, Mahu mi amrin and hashta mi Allah bar havaya. Okay, so he's 7 years old. So right now he's not a bar havaya. He's not someone with whom kiddushin can be chal at all. 0. Or Odilma Asi Lechlal Havaya, but we know that in due time he will be. So is that considered a level of control, a level of non-krisus, which would create for a real condition in the get? Amarle, we already learned the answer to this. Tani Tua, we have a brisa. What does the brisa say? The brisa says 2/3 of the way down, Ketana miskareshes bikdushe aviha, that a young girl is able to be miskareshes. I think I said miskadeshes. Ketana miskareshes can be divorced after the kedushin of her father, which is very interesting because usually the kedushin of the father is a din derabanan, but in order to divorce the chora, so implicit in the Gemara that the chora should be a din deraisa for the gerus. So says the Gemara, Amai, why would this be the case? After all, we need the yitzia and the v'haisa, we need the get and we need the kedushin to be on the same page. And if the kedushin is only derabanan, then the get should only be derabanan. This question of the Gemara implies that the kedushin is derabanan and the get is deoraisa. Ella, rather, it must instead be that if by virtue of the fact that the ketana could be miskareshes bikdushe avia, it must be that since down the road she's going to be a gdola and she will have the capacity to divorce mideoraisa, therefore it works. Same thing is true that a woman who is told by her husband, you're able to be your miskareshes to mean you can marry anyone in the world except for a katan. We are concerned about such a condition, and the get would be possible if such a condition would have been made. What about chutz min hadolad? A man says you can marry anyone on earth, provided that they're born already, but not someone who isn't yet born. Says the Gemara, hashta miha lo isyalid. Would we say that right now that's really not a problem because right now that baby's not born yet, and therefore I understand that makes sense. However, Odilma, perhaps we could say, just like a child will become a gadol, here too, asidi dimisyaldi, there will be more children born into the world. So how do we look at this? Amarlei says, and we're about 3/4 of the way down Tani Tua. This too we learned in our Mishnah. We learned in our Mishnah right here. We didn't talk about this in our Mishnah. So where do we draw this from? The Gemara brings a very clever answer to our question. We're trying to figure out about a baby who's not yet born versus a baby who is born. And the Gemara compares this to our case of le'eved u'le'oved kochavim. Imisa, if you want to say what you're trying to say about a nolad, so then eved ve'oved kochavim nami avida demigaire. Perhaps we can say that even though the eved and even though the goy right now are not perfectly halachically Jewish, like the eved a little bit, but even though they're not fully halachically Jewish to the point that a woman can't marry either of them, perhaps we should say that maybe down the road that there's going to be a gior. And maybe we should say the same thing down the road, even though the baby's not born yet. Maybe we should be concerned that the baby's going to be born, and maybe that should be a real Tanai in the get. So says the Gemara, no. Hanach, these people, the Eved and the Oved Kochavim, lav le'igiyure kaime. They're not like in line at Bezdin to be Megayer. Yes, it's possible, but babies are automatic. Babies happen. They're not automatic, but Lamaisa babies are born. But it's not the standard fare that a goy converts. I just got a phone call today from a woman who said she adopted a baby. The mother's a yid, though the baby's a goy d'oraisa. So, okay, by this case, it's more likely that the kid's going to convert because he's in the context of a Jewish home. So under those circumstances, we can make if the baby's going to convert properly in a firm rabbinical court, so then we can do a bris b'shem u'malchus Lamula Sagerim, some poskim even allow it to say Lachniso B'Riso Shel Avram Avinu. But Lemaisa, if you have Stamagoy, we don't assume that they're going to convert. Hanach Lav Le'Igirei Kaime. But Hani, when we're talking about the birth of children, just go look at the birthing rates. We know the statistics, go look. And the Gemara says over here, Hani Li'Isilude Kaime. And therefore, the condition, L'chora, should be a valid one. The Gemara then says, what if a man says to his wife, you can hereby marry anyone, chutz mi ba'al achosa, except for the husband of your sister, the brother-in-law? It says the Gemara, would that be considered valid? Right now, the woman thinks to herself, my sister is still married to her husband. He's not shaykh to me anyway. So maybe we should look at it in a moment in time and say he's usher to me anyways, and the condition's ridiculous. No different than the first half of the Mishnah. Or perhaps we should say that Zimnin, it certainly does happen, that that down the road, it could be the case that after the divorce, maybe the sister will die, and then the brother-in-law would then become available to her. We don't know the answer to this. So Amarle, the response to this was, Tani Tuha, we have this also in our Mishnah, referring to the same exact case in our Mishnah, the Oved, the Eved, Oved Kochavim. It says the Gemara, Eved, Oved Kochavim, Nami Avidin Megari. So maybe we should say that the Eved and the Oved Kochavim can also change over. They can also convert. So it says the Gemara over here, this is not a raya to our question. Gerus lo shchicha. Conversions are not so common. Far more people die than convert. Misa shchicha. However, Misa shchicha, so you can't bring a raya from me. What if a man says, chutz mi zinusech? He says, I hereby allow you to be divorced on the condition that you don't have any zinus with anyone. Meaning you're not allowed to sleep with someone out of wedlock. That's all right, also usher. So the Gemara is trying to analyze, is that condition that he put in, that she's not allowed to be mezaneh, like holding a cloud over her to the point that the krisus would be questionable. Do we say b'nisuin halo shiur, that he's not restricting her from getting married? She can get married, and at that point she can sleep with her husband, no problem. But he's just making a condition that's out of wedlock. So how would that work? So says the Gemara, do we say b'nisuin halo shiur? He didn't limit her in nisuin, so therefore all is well and good. Or Dilma, do we say shiur b'bia, that he is restricting her from intercourse, from tashma shamita biznus, and afal that it's usher, but he's restricting something that he has a control over her, and therefore it should be problematic. Amarle Tani Tua, we have a raya for this as well. Last of the short lines, the Mishnah that we learned on this page, which is a third of the way down, says la ava ule avich, that the father had given a sample of la ava ule avich uvemai. What was the condition that the husband was giving in regards to the fathers, to his father and to her father? Ilema ben Yisuin, if you want to say that the husband was worried that his wife after divorce would then marry either his father or her father, that's ridiculous. Abba ve'avich ben Yisuin, can't be that he was warning her about Nisuin. The Nisuin is not chal. We discussed this already. Kiddushin is not chal in regards to a person's father and in regards to a person's father-in-law. So if that's the case, that can't be what we're talking about. Elalav, says the Gemara, must be that we're talking about business. And our Mishnah only included the case of ulav ulavi chudelo shiur. In that case, it's not considered to be something that's restrictive in regards to the get. Halachar shiur, but it would be considered an overreach of the husband to say you're not allowed to sleep with anybody else. Says the Gemara, not a good raya, because Dilma bin Isuin to Avar ve'insiv. Maybe in fact they did try to get married to the father. Afal that there was no chalos kedushin, but maybe that's the structure that they went for. We've seen people try to do crazier things where they try to get married to someone that they can't. People, you can think of your own examples. There are plenty of them. What about the next case? And all of the following questions won't have answers to them other than Teku, Tishbi, Atars, Kushios, Uvayos. Says the Gemara, what if a husband says, you're hereby divorced, provided that, Chutz mi shelo kedarka ma'u, as long as all of your tashma shamita is kedarka. But if you have tashma shamita shelo kedarka, that's problematic. Is that considered an overreach or no? B'chedarka, because he didn't restrict her, halo shiur, he didn't restrict her in regular tashma shamita, so therefore it's not a restriction, it's not a cloud that's hovering over her in regards to her krisus. Or Dilmar, perhaps, mishkaveh isha, when we talk about mishkaveh isha, mishkaveh is plural. And Mishkaveh refers to both Bia Kedarka and Bia Shelo Kedarka. Bichlal, this is a Shaila in Poskim, it's quoted in Shulchan Aruch, and it's a very big discussion. But Lamaisa, it's considered to be a form of Tashma Shamita. So perhaps it's the case that he's leaving that tether, that halachic link between him and her by restricting her from Bia Shelo Kedarka. So now we don't know the answer to. What if he says, Chutz me'afaras nidrayach, I'm going to divorce you, but I still will have some control over the nadarim? What do we say, b'nisuin halo shiur, that she's still allowed to marry, and the part of control that he still has isn't about marriage, it's about her nadarim. Odelmor, perhaps that the Torah says that only a husband is involved in that, and therefore this is a husband type of thing that he's holding on to, and therefore that does interfere with the grisus. What about chutz mitruma seich mahu? He says you're divorced, but you can keep eating truma if she's an Eishes Kohen, which by the way is problematic. But even if he said it, it doesn't matter. Let's see. Do we say b'nisuan halo shiur? There's no cloud hanging over her in regards to marriage. She can marry whoever she wants. She gets a perk that she gets to eat the truma. Or Dilma, kinyan kaspo ksiv. Or do we say that no, since the whole heter for a woman to eat the truma is the of kinyan kaspo, so therefore she now appears to still be tethered to her husband, even though it's really not about marriage. And then that says the Gemara chutz mirusha sech. What about he says you're hereby divorced, but I get to keep a tethering to your Yerusha, so that if you die, the husband says to the now divorced wife, I get to keep your bank account. Do we say b'nisuan halo shiur? He's not involved in her nisuan. He's not holding a cloud over her, a tether to her in regards to nisuan. Odilmor, perhaps Alish Ero V'Yarash Osaksiv, that the Psukim speak about this, that there's a link between marriage and between Yerusha. So we don't know the answer to that. And then the Gemara says, Chutz mikidusheich bishtar. Mahu, he says, as long as you don't ever get married, bishtar. Mi armina nefshe the mekadesh lebekesef u'b'bias. We'll soon learn next week in Yirtzeh Hashem in the beginning of Maseches Kedushin. We will learn that there's other options to get married. We don't do the other options nowadays in regards to Kiddushin, but we typically get married b'kesef, which is harei mekudeshes b'tabazu. And one of the things of Masada Kiddushin will tell the Eidim who are there is, does this look like it's worth a shava pruta? Because in order to get married, the kesef has to be of a shava pruta. So when a husband hands her that get, hands her that Kiddushin, it has to be a shava pruta. So if the husband says you're hereby divorced as long as you never get married with kesef again, do we say, well, so what? She can get married in other ways. Odilmor, perhaps v'yotzav ha'isa, iskush havoyos lahadade, or do we say no? The yitzia and the ha'isa, we need all of the opportunities to get married to be halachically equal. And if the husband restricts any of the three possibilities of kesef, shtar, and bia, then that's considered an overreach. Teku, we don't know the answer to any of this last set of questions. Now we have a machlokas in our Mishnah at the very bottom of Pehem at Aleph, going to the top of Pehem. At Beis, the Gemara says, Gufo shall get. What is the actual text of the get? So the Tanakama holds it's quite simple. All you have to write is Hareat Mutaras L'chol Adam. You are permissible to marry anybody else. This doesn't say I hereby divorce you. Nothing, simple. In fact, we'll see in a moment in the Gemara, this is called a yad. This is called a reference to the fact that you're divorced. It doesn't say you're hereby divorced. It just says something that is clearly implicit about the fact that you're divorced. If a husband says to a wife, you're mutaras l'chol adam, no, then you're mutaras l'chol adam. And as we turn to the top of Pehem and Beis, we'll see that there's a dissenting approach here. And the next shita in the Mishnah on the top of Pehem and Beis is the shita of Rabbi Huda. He doesn't believe in the yad, as we'll soon see in the Gemara. He's super explicit. Omer, what does he need to say? V'dein, in this, the ave lichi minoi, that you're taking from me, sefer tiruchin, it's a document to separate me from you. V'yigeres shivukin, it's a letter that you should leave. V'get peturin, and a document that separates us. Lemihach, this is to you. Lehisnaspa lechol gvar deyitzvayin, for you to be allowed to marry anybody else. Very, very different approaches. The Tanakama is much more broad, allowing a yad, and Rabbi Yehuda is far more detailed and explicit, seemingly not allowing a yad. And unrelated, Gufo shall get shichrur. What about a get shichrur? Unrelated at least to an isha. Hareat vaschorin, hareat atzmech. Those two languages work. So first, the Gemara just compares and contrasts the first part of our Mishnah to the second. What if the language of an isha is used for a get shichrur, and what if the language of a get shichrur is used for an isha? The Gemara says 5 lines down on Pehem and Beis, Pshita, if we know the following to be true. Amar lo ishto hareat bas choren lo amar v'lo klum. If a man says to his wife, you are a bas choren, that's a 0. And amar lo shivchaso, if a man says to the shivcha, if a man says to the maidservant, hareat mutaras l'chol adam lo amar v'lo klum, that too does not work in that direction. It says the Gemara, Amar la isha hareat le'atzmech. What about the final language that we see in the Gemara of hareat le'atzmech? Says the Gemara, Mahu. Do we say legamre ka'amar la? That really what he's trying to do is to say that we're actually properly, fully divorced. Oh, or perhaps we say lemalacha ka'amar la, that the language of hareat le'atzmech is, you don't need to give me your money anymore if you're going to take care of yourself. We have an answer to this question. Gufo shall get shichror hareat baschor and hareat la'atzmech. The Mishnah says in regards to the language of a get shichror, as we just saw on the top of the page, is that if a man says to, if a Baal says to the Eved that you are a baschorin or you are to yourselves, then they go free. Uma avda, just like an Eved, dekani le'legufe, where the Baal actually owns the Eved, and there, ki amar le'hareat le'atzmeich kani gufe, and there, when he owns her, the language frees her up and says you're no longer an Eved, then Isha delo kani gufa, then a woman whom we don't own our wives. That's not how that works. There's an aspect of a kinyan, but we don't own their physical bodies. So there, lo kol shekain, all the more so this language should work. Next, Amar le Ravina the Ravashi, Amar le la'avdo, if a man says to his Eved, Ein li esek bach mahu, I have nothing to do with you anymore. So Amar le Rav Chanan the Ravashi, Rav Chanan says to Ravashi, and ve'amri la, Rav Chanan mechuzna the Ravashi, we're not sure which Rav Chanan it was. Apparently, there were two different people. Tashma de Tanya, we have a brisa. Hamocher avdo le'ovei kochavim. If a man sells his eved to a goy, yatsa lecherus v'tzarach get shichror me'rabo rishon, then he needs to go free, and he needs to get a shtar shichror that says that really he should be free from the rabo rishon, from the first husband, from the first baal, I should say. And the brisa continues, Amar of Shimon ben Gamliel, when is this true? That's only true when ono was not written. We'll see what that means in a moment. But if ono was written, then zehu shichruro, then he in fact would be free. It says the Gemara, my ono, Amar of Sheshes, the kasavav lechashetivrach mimenu, ainli esekbach. Only when you run away, that's when you're going to be free. If that language is written, then says the Gemara, then that's going to be their shichrur. All right, that brings us halfway down on the page. We're going to dig in a little bit to Rabbi Yehuda. This will bring us to the second to last line on the page, and we'll be stopping right there at the bottom of the page. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, V'dein dehav elichi minoi sefer teruchen v'ger shivuken, the language that we saw on the very top of the page in the Mishnah, the language of Rabbi Yehuda, that this that I am giving you from me is a sefer teruchen. It's a book that separates us v'ger shivuken. It's a letter that makes us leave one another. Why is it that the Rabbanon are that the Tanakama is super simple and he can use a yad and he says you can go marry anybody else? The language of you can go marry anybody else is not explicit. It doesn't actually say that they're divorced, but the Tanakama says that the implications are perfect, no problem at all. Masha'en Kain, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we need all of this express and explicit language that the divorce has taken place. So the Gemara says, Rabbanon Savra Yadayim She'en Mochichos Havyan Yadayim, that when you have a yad, when you have a reference to the reality, and the reference here is not that I am hereby divorcing you. The reference is just that you're harat mutaras l'chol adam. You can marry anyone. What's implied from that? If a husband says you can go marry everyone, what does it imply? So the Tanakama says, Pashad, what it implies. Everybody knows what it implies. It's a basic diuk that you obviously are divorced. However, the reason why the Chachamim don't like it is because they don't hold of Yadayim. And let's first finish up the sheet of the Tanakama. So the Rabbanan say that Yadayim she'en mochichos havyan Yadayim, v'afal gavdo lo kasav lavedain, and even though it doesn't say explicitly that this is for you and we are divorced like Rabbi Yehuda, mukha milsa the Bahai Gita kamegarish. It's pashut, it's clear. She's holding a document, and it says on it that the husband says she can go marry anybody else. The Tanakama holds of the opinion that Yadayim are mochichos. Even Yadayim she'en mochichos havyan Yadayim. And then Rabbi Yehuda Savar, no, Rabbi Yehuda argues and says, Yadayim she'en mochichos lo havin Yadayim. No, the get needs to be explicit. It cannot only be implicit. The time of the cause of love had vidain, and the reason why we need to be so explicit, as we have the language at the very top of this page, vidain dehavi lichi minai, this is the document for me to you, the sefer teruchen v'chulei. The reason why we have all of this is because the mukha milsa the Bahai. The time of the cost of Lavadain, because only then the Mukha Milsa, the Bahai Gita Kamagarishla, then it's crystal clear. Nothing is left to chance. Aval, lo kasav Lavadain. If we wouldn't have written that, Amre, I might have argued that Bidibura Garsha, Ushtara Raya Ba'almu. Maybe because the shtar is not explicit, I might have thought that it was only being used as an ancillary proof. But really the verbal was the attempted divorce, and a verbal divorce doesn't work. And now the Gemara just goes through some very brief halachos as to the spelling of the language of Rabbi Yehuda's Aramaic phraseology. Amar Abai, Haiman de Kosav Gita. If a person is going to write a get like Rabbi Yehuda would have written it, lo lichtov vidain with a yud in it, demashma vidin, ela vidain. You should write it the proper way without the yud, because otherwise, instead of saying "and this is your get," it sounds like the halacha is that we should get divorced vidin, and that's not correct. And as well, below lichtov igeres with a yud, demashma igeres with a yud, which is a roof. It's a different word. Ella, you should write igeres without a yud, which implies a letter, which is exactly what we want the implications to be. Below lichtov limhach, that this is for you with a yud in it. Demashma li mehach, to me from you, which is completely not correct. Below lichtov limchach, don't mix up the hay and make it into a ches. Demashma kichucha, that it's like some kind of joke or some kind of humorous, Purim shtick. And also the Ishavyon and the Isyatvion, each of these two words should be with tlasa yud, with 3 yuds in them. It's not normal spelling. Why do we do that? Because without the extra yud, the mashma tehavyon utitzavyon, and the double yud in Aramaic and grammar implies the language of they and not the language of you. And velurche levav de teruchen, you should lengthen the vav of teruchen, and levav de shvukin, make sure the vavs are long enough. Why? The mashma trichin ushvikin, because if you don't do that, then that also will be a different word and have a different implication. Vilurche levav de kadu, and also as well that if we use the language of kadu, so the Gemara says we should make sure that we do that. The mashma ukdi, if you mess up the yud, then that would also be a problem. Below lichtov leisnasba with an aleph, the mashma lo yisnasba, because it looks like you can break up the word to lo and yisnasba. Rather, elo lehisnasba with a hey, so that there wouldn't be such a concern. Last but not least, the Gemara says 7 lines from the bottom of the page. Bo'inan v'dain or lo bo'inan v'dain. How do we paskin? Do we paskin like the chacham who are relying on yadayim she'enan mochichos havin yadayim? You can just say you can hereby marry any man. And that's of course implicit. There's a divorce. Oh no! Or instead, do we say that we hold like like Rabbi Yehuda, and we need the explicit language? So the Gemara says Toshma the Iskin Rava made a takana begite. He would say Ech ploni bar plania, that the husband is going to divorce this wife. Tarech yas plus nisa, and on inchase the havas intase min kadam. This woman, they used to be married before dana miyoma dinanu la'alaman, but from now on they're divorced. What do we see in here? That we don't have the exact language of Rabbi Yehuda. We don't have the language of the Dain. So says the Gemara, the Dain lo ka'amar. So haraya that Rava doesn't hold like the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, must be held like the Rabbana. The Gemara says that makes no sense. Well, the Tamech, according to you, kolu mi ka'amar. He doesn't hold like anybody, because the language that he's using here is not found according to the Tanakama, the Rabbana, and it's not found according to Rabbi Yehuda. So says the Gemara, Hacha nami ba'inan. Rather, we assume that we do need that language, and we are only getting a snippet of what Rava would have put into a get, but not the full picture. But really, we do seem to need that. The Rambam seems to quote this halacha lemaisa. This is also quoted in Shulchan Aruch and Even Ezer Siman Kuf Nun Dalet Siv Kuf Aleph in the Ramah, and the Chora. Our Gittin have to be much more explicit. We'll stop right here, and we'll pick up tomorrow at the very bottom line of Pei Hamid Beis. Wishing you all a beautiful night.